I start with the notion that cosmology is endlessly fascinating because it puts us in our place, in context, in a sense. When you think about the majesty and magnitude of what we have just seen, we shrink into relative insignificance. But I'm going to one of the punchlines, which didn't make it onto the handout. Dr. Weissman reminded me that core question about human significance or insignificance. And I would posit that we already have the answer, which is both. Reb Simcha Bunim, famously 200 years ago, one of the great aphorisms of Jewish thought, basically said, and you can almost imagine that Jews were already into Chinese food, so you have to picture little fortune cookie slips, and thank you. That's great. Picture little fortune cookie slips, and you actually got two, and you love them so much that you keep them every day, one in each pocket. And in one pocket that you pull out at appropriate moments, it says, "I am but dust and ashes," which is a biblical verse. And in the other, it says, "For my sake, the world was created." We have simultaneously infinite and infinitesimal significance. And if we start there, that long before serious exoplanetary research, Simcha Bunim already nailed it. It's actually about both. Maimonides, 600 years earlier than that, talked about the golden mean, striving for the medium point in everything. He was actually echoing Aristotle and the golden mean. Shvil HaZahav, the golden path, is how it was described by the Rambam. We've had this notion for a long time. And so we need to hold those extremes. And I strongly suspect that exoplanetary life will be directly or indirectly proven in my lifetime, and quite plausibly any day now, and thus in all of our lifetimes. Obviously, there's no way to know, but the odds seem good based on the kind of research that we've just heard about. And I also strongly suggest that it will be a source of fascination, and it will lead to a shift, I pray, toward a greater universal consciousness, but it will not ultimately be a crisis of faith for most people, certainly not for most Jews, definitely not for Reconstructionist Jews. So, with all of that said, implicit in Dr. Weissman's teaching was something that I'm surprised you didn't actually mention, Dr. Frank Drake and the Drake equation, which she was hinting at. How many of us are familiar with the Drake equation? All right. So this is a little bit of trivia that even though I'm not an expert in anything in the astrobiological realm, I was going to be an astrophysicist until I was going to be a rabbi. That shift took place at about age 12, but at age 10, I got an award from Dr. Frank Drake for being a cute kid at the Great Lakes Astronomical Society, giving a nothing little report, but getting a cute little, glass paperweight as a result. Anyway, I had the honor of hearing him back when this was circa 1980, when this stuff was just emerging, and he and Dr. Carl Sagan had just put the Voyager stuff together to raise the question.
Right
and
here.
oh,
like
wonderful! Oh, that'd be great. Okay. Thank you. So actually, the last 10 minutes, Jennifer was walking us through most of the steps, but you put in your answers to 10 or 12 variables, starting with how many galaxies, how many stars per galaxy, how many planets per star, what percentage in the habitable zone. You have to plug all these variables in, and what science has done since Dr. Drake articulated this a few decades ago is begin to fill in likely ranges for those variables. The most interesting to my mind is at the end, which is what percentage of those that have life, what percentage is multicellular, and then what percentage is at a level of communication, right? Think about it. We've had life on Earth for nearly 4 billion years, but we've only had serious multicellular since the Precambrian explosion. That's only 500 million years. So 7/8 of Earth's life history would have been fairly small. and only slowly, as that great slide about the oxygen, methane, and CO2 shows, only recently meaning the last billion or 2 years, have we been able to really see even the trace of life in the atmosphere. We've only had the kind of life that we now know, the various phyla, for 500 million years. We've only had communicative life, as far as we know, for a few tens of thousands of years, which is nothing.
There's your drink.
Thank you. And of course, we've only begun to broadcast "I Love Lucy" to out to the rest of the universe only in the last less than a century. So it's amazing. So one of the Drake equation questions at the bottom, right, from the length of time such civilizations release detectable signals into space, raises the fascinating question of what is the future of intelligent life? We're really at the front end of it. It's nothing, right? Out of a 13.8 billion year history, all that we know for sure is civilization for some 10 to 40,000 years, and technical civilization with the kind of footprint we now know from carbon dating, really only the Industrial Revolution, 200 years. Project forward 100,000. Will we even still be here? Will we be recognizable? Will we have annihilated ourselves, or will we have figured out how to evolve into higher realms? And this is where science and what we now call science fiction or fantasy overlap, right? Those of us who know Robert Heinlein, etc., those kinds of tropes are in our head, but this is actually cutting-edge scientific research. Fill in the variables as you see fit. So I wonder at some level how much my environmental orientation and future theology was shaped by hearing Dr. Frank Drake when I was 10 and being really inspired and awed by that possibility, because again, before I knew who Reb Simcha Bunim was and this idea that we are simultaneously everything and nothing, at some level that's implicit. And this is one of those beautiful postmodern places where science and religion meet. Right? In a post-Heisenberg, postmodern world, it is plausible to say that the mythic and moral truths of religion and the empirical truths of science need not be in conflict. And Rabbi George certainly has a lot more to say about that. That's in some ways his life's work. That is why we have the Institute for Science and Judaism, and I would love to hear Dr. Weissman on this as well. So very quickly through this. 4 main categories of the question of implications for Jewish theology. Number 1, what does the Jewish tradition actually say? So go now to the back of page 2. I didn't do this original research. Robert Price of Chicago a couple years ago published a piece online that laid out just a few of the core texts. So 2 of them are from Psalms. Psalm 68:18 has this very interesting notion that God has myriad chariots, even thousands upon thousands, which is at least, and a number in Midrash is 18,000. Footnote, in the Hadith, not the Holy Quran itself, but in the Hadith, 18,000 worlds is also mentioned, one of those amazing places in antiquity where Judaism and Islam yet again overlap one with the other. So this notion that God is made manifest in all these different realms. Staggering numbers of realms. And one that many of us know, we even know the melody for it from the Hasidic festival. If you know, please join me. Psalm 145, verse 13. Malchutcha, malchut kol olamim, umemshaltecha, bechol dor vador. Malchutcha, malchut kol olamim, umemshaltecha, bechol dor vador. So it's even in kind of the greatest hits Jewish discography, this line from Ashrei, Psalm 145, a key part of the liturgy, that your dominion, your kingdom, is actually a kingdom kol olamim, for all the worlds. Olam is a very interesting slippery word. It's both time and space, and it connotes infinity as well, so it can be used in any of those 3 contexts, but it's God's dominion is for all time and for all space, and it also quite literally is the plural for world. How would you, if world is olam, more than one world would be the olamim. So God is the God of all the worlds. It's almost as if the psalmist understood that there would be the kind of proof that we've only had for just a generation since those first exoplanets were proven. It gets interesting, but not necessary in a funny way, in a liberal context, to delve further. In the 14th century, Rav Chasdai Kreskas, a very important thinker, actually raised the question and said, sure, there could be. And then his student, Rav Yosef Albo, said, no, it can't be, because that would violate our core theological notions. And then there's been a debate ever since. A very interesting text is from just around the time of the first SETI ferment, as people like Drake and Sagan were beginning to think this through, around the time of the moon landings. Rabbi Norman Lamb, a very important voice in modern orthodoxy, longtime head of Yeshiva University, wrote a book called Faith and Doubt from 1971. It's a fascinating read. And as Roger Price articulates out of that, a few key questions, because Rabbi Lamb, as a leading American Orthodox Jew of the previous generation, although he's still very much around, basically says, yeah, of course, it's plausible, perhaps likely, and it's not going to change all that much. So even traditional theological voices within our time frame have accepted that this is possible. And I love the line from Norman Lamb that no religious position is loyally served by refusing to consider annoying theories which may well turn out to be facts. Judaism, we are very lucky in many ways compared to some other world traditions that even our centrist position is pro-science. Right? Every religion has pro-science wings. I would even say medieval Christendom did as well, although obviously leading authorities imprisoned Galileo, etc. And the whole, today, how half of America doesn't even necessarily accept evolution as settled fact because they're relying on a particular reading of Scripture. Right? Well, we have other readings of Scripture, but we also can say Scripture, again, is mythic truth rather than empirical truth, and Judaism doesn't typically have those same kinds of challenges. We are, by and large, a pro-science tradition. So for those reasons, I would posit Jewish theology is open to the confirmation of what we're talking about today, but making it a little more personal. Second major section here, this idea about the tension between the universal and the particular. Every tradition has this. Are we out for ourselves, the narrow us, or for the larger us? Classic example, there's this famous text in the Mishnah, which again is also found in the Holy Quran. It's another one of those beautiful places where the traditions come together. Whoever saves one life, it's as if they've saved the whole world. Whoever destroys one life, it's as if a whole world has been destroyed. And there are two different versions of this text. One says, Kol hamatzil nefesh achat, whoever saves one life. And the other says, Kol hamatzil nefesh achat beYisrael, whoever saves one life within the community of Israel. As if an Israelite life has infinite value, but from someone outside it does not. And we have this tradition. Here's two different copies of our sacred authoritative Mishnaic text, one of which goes insular and one of which goes universal. This is a tension that plays out in every tradition, in every generation. And there is a view that says ours is right. Of course, every tradition has that exclusivist reading, and while we're now seeing the painful effects of that minority in Islam that does that, much of the Western world suffered from that view within Christianity for large swaths of the last 2 millennia, and even in the Jewish world, it's very painful the way that's playing out, certainly in the ultra-right in Israel today. Those who say it's all about the narrow us. So I cannot speak for my co-religionists who define us most narrowly. The good news is even the center, as well as the left, has typically chosen the broader, more expansive definition of who us is. So I'm thinking of Matrushka dolls, I'm thinking of layers of the onion, right? How do we go from self and family and neighborhood and community and co-religion, and some people end there, right? And then others go to nation and world, or all of humanity, and end there. And then, well, that's still earthbound. well, actually, that's still only one species. So the next step, which is the next section, eco-theology, is saying, now let's broaden that layer of concern to acknowledge that we are part of something bigger, and that something bigger is the web of creation. It's the chorus of all beings. And that's a radical step that a lot of us are still working on, that I and other environmental thinkers are within religion are saying is the necessary next step. What's so fascinating about exoplanetary life as a possibility is that then goes many more orders of magnitude beyond, so that it's not only that all of life is of interest to us and we are somehow interconnected. What about even life on other planets, perhaps of radically different forms? So, remarkable idea that we can take this in, and even though that the life that we identify on exoplanets will necessarily be multiple light years away, and in some cases perhaps, pardon the expression, astronomical distances, as if a few light years isn't, but nonetheless, how can we say that we are somehow bound up together? So there's this beautiful expression in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 19, Parshat Shmini, the laws of kashrut, and among the birds that we're not allowed to eat is the chasidah, which tradition says is the stork. And what up with the stork? This isn't about little baby packages, but chasidah is a very funny name because from chesed, chasidah literally means righteous or loving kindness. A chasid is someone who's very pious with loving kindness. Why would a bird be called that? And in the old model, where you are what you eat, and so you actually go out of your way to imbue yourself with substances that have the characteristics you want in yourself, why would it be not kosher? And so Reb Menachem Mendel of Kutsk, who's an early Hasidic master around the same time as Reb Simcha Bunim of the Two Fortune Cookie Slips, this later Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev says, I've looked around at birds, I've read some ornithological manuals, and here's the funny thing about the stork. It will stop and forage for food on behalf of a fellow stork that is sick or hungry or tired, and go out of its way, interrupt its routine, to place in its beak this food and then put it into the bill of its fellow stork. Oy, we should all be so righteous, so loving kindness as the Hasidah, right? Great. Why then is it not kosher? Because it only does that for fellow storks. But if it's a sparrow or a starling or a spotted owl, it will fly on by. So that boundary question, to be righteous, we must have special concern for our own, and that applies for our family, that applies for our people, that applies for our species, that applies for our planet. But can we then also extend Reb Levi Yitzchak's commentary on the stork to say that we need to include in our consciousness, and perhaps even concern, the question of life even further afield? I think that our classical training is already there to help provide some of the wisdom that we will need when those questions emerge. And that includes the ethical questions that are now being asked, right? Just this week, we crashed a probe on Mercury and put a 52-foot crater in place. That's not much compared to the size of Mercury, and given that it boils at 800 degrees when it's exposed to the sun, we're not sure that it's doing much to the ecosystem there, but there are still interesting questions of interplanetary ethics, right? Our approach to the natural resources and preservation of this Earth hasn't been so great, and that same technological civilization that is putting alarming rates of carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere at our own peril is now beginning to put stuff out into certainly near orbit, where space junk is a big issue and growing, but we're also putting stuff out for the first time now, even beyond the inner boundary of the solar system. Fascinating stuff. So, with all that said, two last things. One, Mordechai Kaplan. It's a lot easier with religious naturalist theology. Kaplan is the guy, the Jewish version of Paul Tillich and others in the Christian faith who have articulated, and of course the sources go back all the way to the Torah and the Talmud and Maimonides, right? This isn't just a modern newfangled idea, and it's Aristotelian as well, that God is actually much more of a force or a process with a capital P than a being with a capital B. And if you believe that with Mordechai Kaplan, then there isn't a chooser. There isn't someone who chooses Israel over other peoples, right? There also isn't one who chooses humanity over other species, and there isn't one who chooses Earth over other planets. It's all part of something amazing, miraculous in its hugeness and interconnectedness, and we stand in awe of the totality. So Kaplan uses language like God is the power that makes for salvation. Salvation meaning our ability to find ourselves, our ability to simply be. We should never take that for granted. He also, on a train coming back from St. Louis once in 1937, he wrote in his diary, it's been good, I taught Torah, I'm making a living, I had good food, and I'm being whisked overnight back to New York. I offer my appreciation to the life with a capital L, love with a capital L, and intelligence with a capital I of the universe. Call God the life, love, and intelligence of the universe already in 1937, and you are well on your way to accepting exoplanetary life. And skipping a whole lot, there's interesting stuff about Heschel too, but no time. I do strongly believe that the religious environmental ethic is very much at play here for all those reasons we talked about continuing to broaden. We have to get to the thorny key question. Are humans the object of creation? Are we the telos? And here I have to correct a common misunderstanding. How many times in Genesis chapter 1 is the word good applied? 7 days of creation, how many times do we have the word tov? God describing something as good. 5? 6? 7, but day 2 doesn't get a single one. One day gets doubled, and only 6 of them are a tov alone. Right? Good, more or less for each of the days. We get to Friday afternoon, it's almost Shabbos. God is about finished creating, says, wait, I got one more in me. Na'aseh Adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu. Hey, what do you say? Chapter 1, verse 26, we make this human after our likeness. Don't get me started on what's the hour, the plural there. And let's create this thing in the divine image. And let it have dominion over the rest of it. And then that happens in the next 2 verses, and then there's some more stuff. And then, what does God say in the text immediately following the creation of the human? Tov ma'od, very good, is in fact the next tov, the next good. It's the very good, but here's the thing. That's not about humans. Humans alone don't even get good because we're blessed to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Been there, done that, right? And have dominion, which effectively we do. And then it says, be vegetarians. And then it says, and God stepped back. We're essentially at the end of day 6 now. The book of creation is closed. Vayar Elohim et kol asher asa. And God looked at all that God had created. Vihine, and check it out, tov ma'od. It was very good. Usually we think, in the popular imagination, the rest of creation is good, humans are very good. Read the text carefully. Creation is good at periodic intervals. Humans are created, the jury is out. The interconnected whole of which we are one part, kol asher asa, all that God created, tov ma'od, it's very good. So, we have Rashi, Maimonides, these key thinkers who all remind us in different ways that our dominion is conditional. That we are maybe the top of the food chain, maybe the species that because of a well-developed front cortex and this awesome opposable thumb ipso facto, we have dominion. But we are not instructed to exercise that dominion willy-nilly. We are to understand ourselves as part of the chorus of creation. As Psalm 150 famously says, Kol hanshama, all that has a soul, all that has breath, Tahallel Yah, let it be part of that chorus of praise. Or as Bill Staines famously sung a generation ago, all God's critters got a place in the choir. Some sing low and some sing higher, but right, we're all singing this chorus of praise together. And humans are like the mezzo-soprano, right? We've got one high voice that soars sometimes above the rest, but ultimately we're in it with the tenor and the bass, right? And if we cut out any of those voices, then the chorus is no longer whole. And what we're now discovering as we shift beyond the range of what was formerly visible, as if toward ultraviolet or infrared, we are suddenly discovering the auditory analogy that chorus is even bigger than we thought. And we may not hear the chirping of exoplanetary life for a while. That'll take even more refined instruments. But presumably it's out there. And if we start from that ethic that we so desperately need here and now in the days before we find the proof, which is let's take better care of what we've got. And let's keep ourselves in that context of being one part of a glorious chorus. And then when we discover the chorus is a little bit larger than we thought, it'll be awesome, but it won't change much.
It's actually for Rabbi Fred, and I'm struggling with the thought experiment. And let's say that we did discover life on another planet, exoplanet, and we have the means to observe that life very closely. And it turns out that it's human-like, human civilization-like, around the times of our patriarchs, Moses and so on. And they have just discovered monotheism, and they have just discovered that they are the chosen people who are the one and only. And we observed it, and we observed it not only on one exoplanet, we may observe it on many. What I'm trying to do is write the script of what would the theologians on our world of different denominations and different religions say and respond to that discovery. And I'm very curious about what you would.
So again, I can only speak on behalf of the more pluralistic, liberal interpretations of Scripture and not the more fundamentalist ones. Clearly, fundamentalism will be in a bit of trouble, right? Although you would think it was in trouble with Copernicus and then again with Darwin, but belief is actually precisely independent of fact. And so perhaps the accumulation of yet more facts that question the cosmology of any one particular scripture, be it biblical or otherwise, it may not change much for those who believe because they believe independent of fact, and sometimes directly against it. But for the rest of us, it will be further confirmation of this notion that we are simultaneously everything and nothing. And it'll be cool to know that we've got distant cousins somewhere out there. And there's certainly a slim band of possibility that life at the same level as us that figured out how to destroy stuff before it figured out that it needed an ethic of sustainability so that it doesn't destroy itself, right? I suspect that that's a period, if we can survive it, that's only measured in a few orders of magnitude of years, right? Because sooner or later, if human civilization, Earth civilization is to survive, we're going to have to band together around climate change. We're going to have to band together around narrowness, around the weaponization of the planet, around nanotech, biotech. I mean, there's so many issues that are facing us, and the very process of surviving the challenges that lie ahead suggests that the next epoch will be one in which we, and presumably any other interstellar civilization, would choose not to come Darth Vader-like out to another one. Of course, Maybe we're wrong, and for all we know, there's a Death Star aimed at us right now. Odds, I believe, of that are pretty slim, but that's because of the variables that I personally put in the Drake equation, and my guess is as good as anyone else's, and not as good as hers. So,
so the issue about sustainability reminds me of part of the discussion. It's almost like there's this concept of we're running out of time on our planet, we're looking for other places where we could colonize, which is kind of is a little bit of a negative view. And also in the search for other planets, how much of it is search for other life versus how much is search for other planets that could sustain our life? So there's this
Those are two different questions. So the second part of your question was how much of what we're doing now in the science community is searching for habitability for life like our own, and how much of it is it looking for other types of life elsewhere? We are looking right now, people are kind of disappointed to find out sometimes that we haven't actually found inhabited planets that are sending signals. They may be out there, but we just haven't discovered them yet. The steps that we're taking as scientists is to try to get a big picture view of whether planets are common, what kinds of planets are out there, how many of them are in what we call the habitable zones around their stars, so that they're not too hot, they're not too cold, they're not getting too much killer radiation from their parent stars. Could they sustain atmospheres? We're still trying to understand why some planets in our own solar system have thick atmospheres and some don't. We're trying to understand why Mars and Venus, which technically are in the habitable zone of our own star, have had such very different climate histories. And so Mars apparently in the past had water, lots of it, liquid water, lakes, rivers. Now we find it only in frozen frost under the dirt and at the poles, and it's pretty much of a dry, frozen desert on Mars. Why the climate change? Venus went the other direction and has turned into this out-of-control greenhouse situation. So it is very inhospitable, but it may not have always been that way. So why is that? So we're trying to understand our own solar system, and we're trying to understand how life thrives in the most extreme conditions on Earth, so that we know what kinds of planets to look for elsewhere that might be habitable for life. And then we are limited to being able to detect remotely, only remote sensing things from exoplanets. We can't send probes yet outside of our own solar system. So we have to figure out what kinds of life processes would produce changes in the atmosphere of the planet that we could detect remotely. So that's the whole idea of looking for signs of oxygen or water vapor in the planet's atmosphere. And yes, that is really a sense of trying to find out what kinds of planets might be out there that would be habitable for life like we have on planet Earth. And in some sense, maybe whether there are strong signs of biological activity on those planets. But that's about as far as we can go right now. We're not yet to the stage of looking for planets where we as humans could go visit or migrate to, unless there are planets or moons in our own solar system. And we're trying right now to see if we can get to Mars and place destinations like that, hopefully in the not too distant futures.
Right. So as a long-term civilizational bid, just like it's good to be tracking asteroids that could become meteors, it's good to keep our options open, but we are probably hundreds of years away, if even ever, from the possibility of true interstellar travel. We just don't know the kinds of issues. There was an article just this week about how much cosmic radiation would probably hurt the human body. You can't put that much shielding up, right? So, how much of Star Trek is ever going to come to fruition? We have absolutely no idea. There may just be physical barriers. But it's worth keeping our options open. But God forbid that we should undo some other planet as quickly as we have effectively undone our own. When you think about the level of topsoil, what we've done to carbon, these things that are actually measurable from space, the impact of just a few generations of people with well-intentioned but ultimately profoundly short-sighted approaches. And we still have that with how we get the energy for, getting home. So we need a lot of rethinking before we think about colonizing other worlds. There's a very, let's get the ethics together at home before we even think about interstellar ethics, if we ever need to get there. One last thing I meant to say before, this amazing thing called the anthropic principle, this fascinating question of what are the odds that life is sustainable? What does it mean that we have a habitable or a stable orbit around a stable star for the numbers of billions of years to get to this point? What does it mean that where most substances get heavier as they are solid, water, the basis of life, gets lighter when it's solid, and thus life was able to survive the deep freezes of periodic geological history, that we have all of these low-odds scenarios that come together to make our existence. So even if it's all scientifically explicable, it is still miraculous by the very definition of our ancestors, who wrote in the daily Amidah, thank you, God, Amnisecha shebechol yom imanu, for your miracles that are every day with us. The real miracle is not the suspension of the natural order. The real miracle is photosynthesis and the water cycle. And let us never take those basics for granted. And then whatever that does to the odds you plug into the Drake numbers, have fun with it.
Interesting.
More than 50 years ago, when I was in graduate school, I was asked, actually by Frank Drake, to search for the interstellar space line of hydroxide. As you probably know, hydroxide is a very common interstellar space molecule, or not exactly a molecule, sort of a molecule. And the idea that he had was that if someone is going to signal us, they're going to use these universal frequencies, either the hydrogen line or the hydroxide line. So my question is there currently an active effort to look to see if anybody is signaling at those frequencies?
That would be something that the SETI program would be trying to do, and I'm not up to speed on exactly which of these lines, these frequencies that they are looking at, but that would probably most certainly be one they are. What's interesting to me is that the SETI program is targeting, as well they should, some of these planetary systems that are looking more promising due to the observational work done from the Kepler telescope and the others. And so instead of just doing kind of a random search of the sky, it's helpful, and I think that they've got the right idea to at least spend part of their time focusing on some of these stars and star systems that have been shown to have planets, and maybe even have planets in the habitable zone. So if you can focus in your antennae on systems that have a higher probability of being habitable for life and civilizations, you might have a higher chance of finding a signal. And I don't know if they're using those particular lines, but of hydrogen and hydroxide, but I would not be surprised if they were, because that, as you say, those are promising. Of course, you have to kind of guess what would an alien civilization be thinking. Would they be thinking the same way we do? Probably not, but you do the best you can. So it's interesting also that the SETI Institute has itself evolved from focusing just on listening for signals, but also doing some of this work in astrobiology, trying to understand what are the range of conditions in which life that we could conceive of as being life might be able to exist and thrive long enough to develop into advanced civilizations that could be sending signals. And so they're doing some fundamental work in astrobiology from their end as well, and that's feeding into their strategies as to where to point these receivers and to try to listen for intentional signals.
Yes. Realize we never defined core terms. SETI, search for extraterrestrial intelligence, which again on human metric would be 4 billion years after the search for life. So, the search for extraterrestrial life is actually many orders of magnitude likelier than extraterrestrial intelligence, just based on the Drake equation. But the two do feed into each other.
That's true.
In very simplistic terms, with abstract ideas growing up, when I would talk with crazy discussions as a kid, talking about the existence of God and not but chicken dolls, but chicken and egg, because there's always somebody, because, okay, with what came first. And then we talk about Star Trek. I think of one of the episodes where there was this giant mythological, god, like Greek gods who could have been the creator, but when looking at theology versus science, I just want to throw out there something you didn't mention, which is we're so much in the minority as Reconstructionists, because if you when you're looking at the concepts of how much religion and theology can accept the science, we also have to look at the concept of God, because when I've talked to people about accepting science with religion, it's that, well, of course it doesn't interfere, because God could have created it that way. God could have done anything. But if we take away the concept of God as a single sentient being, then it throws everything off. So I was just going to throw that out to you.
Again, I would say it throws many things off. I mean, you're right. The fundamentalists would say that, carbon-14 dating of dinosaur bones is actually put there to throw us off scent so that only the really faithful hold on to the true narrative against all this empirical fact. So there's no arguing with that voice. But certainly much more than 100 years ago, and even more than 50, and certainly more than 500 years ago, there's a willingness to accept empiricism. And for a lot of us, that doesn't mean the death of God or death of religion. It means the nuancing of religion. And again, Kaplan, drawing on Aristotle and Maimonides, etc., or Tillich and other of those more liberal theological voices, actually put in place the kind of theology that can let us hold on to the best of traditional religion and still make sense of a universe in which we are far from alone. And so, yes, it's all about God, which is why this is implications for theology, but it depends on your starting point for theology. And needless to say, theology changes, right? There is no such thing as traditional theology, because every time and place and every sect has had its own particular view, and even what we think of now as fundamentalist has changed over time. And that's a core insight that we just need to understand, again, that there's empirical fact for the idea that traditional theology has shifted over the generations, Jewish, Islamic, Christian, etc. And it will continue to, and hopefully it will evolve in light of growing human knowledge.
This is for both of you. I was just wondering what both the scientific and the theological thoughts would be about something like terraforming some other body, like a moon or Mars or something. I know it's maybe a little premature, but to make it habitable to Earthlings. What would be the response of the scientific community and the theological?
Okay, well, just quickly, I mean, this gets into the question of as humans reach out farther and farther, should we be, having quote unquote dominion over, should our dominion expand, and should we utilize space as a resource for human? And, I don't know the right answer to that. Some people would say, no, hands off, we've made a mess of this planet, let's not, carry our problems elsewhere.
What's your sense of?
Others would say, no, it's a great idea. We need to be looking for other places to live, and maybe we can create peaceful communities elsewhere. So my sense is that if any of that were ever to take place, it's not in the near future, and I'll tell you why. It's expensive to try to live someplace where your human body is not adapted to, a place without an atmosphere is not a really pleasant place, or without oxygen, or without natural water. It's hard to create an artificial environment. It's a little different when Europeans, quote unquote, discovered the New World. Of course, there were already humans in the West, but still, there was the basics of life were there, plants and air and so forth. It was just an adaptation for the Europeans. from one environment to one that was a little different, but going off-site, people talk about mining asteroids and mining the moon and all that, and if you're going to try to do that with human beings, that's really hard to sustain the human element in all of this. So practically speaking, I don't see it happening anytime real soon, although I did watch all those neat science fiction movies growing up about building other colonies.
And again, besides having the eco-theology apply, if we can't take care of our own house, are we ready to then take care of other houses? But we're very far from it, and the European analogy is good. Not only may there be some much more primitive sort of life in some of these places that we would colonize, and remember the dehumanization of natives as part of the narrative 500 years ago, but also think about how many hundreds of years of dislocation and pain for the conquerors as well as for the conquered, because that adaptation wasn't easy, and that was just from one biome area to another that were very similar compared to moon or Mars or asteroid or exoplanet. Oy vavoy, it would be, again, orders of magnitude more challenging. And yes, we have a lot of technology, but we also have a history of putting more faith in our technology than is necessarily deserved. And we need to approach this all with some humility.
Last question.
If you would care to, could you expose us to some of the observations you've had interacting either in your own faith or in other faiths through your work at Dozer about this issue of extraterrestrial life and its potential discovery?
Is that okay? I was
going to ask you that.
Can I show a couple of slides? Is that okay? All right. So this is a really interesting question. I didn't even plant it, but that was a good question. So my other hat, I'm an astronomer, my one hat. My other hat is that, as you heard, I direct this dialogue on science, ethics, and religion program for the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And it's the world's largest science advocacy society. And we have sessions and events on all kinds of hot science topics and how different religious communities respond to them. But one topic that we've had more than one event regarding is this whole idea of the impact of finding life beyond Earth. And let me just show you some of the interesting commentary on that. So it turns out Ted Peters, who's a Lutheran theologian, did a survey of several religious groups to find out if their faith would be knocked out, or if they would be really, truly facing a crisis if we found an evidence of a civilization of intelligent beings off of the planet. All right? So the question, he did a survey of many questions, but one question, a statement, true or false, do you agree or disagree with this? Official confirmation of the discovery of a civilization of intelligent beings living on another planet would so undercut my beliefs that my beliefs would face a crisis. Is that true or not true for you? And he asked Catholics and Protestant evangelicals, Protestant mainlines, okay, Orthodox, Mormons, Jewish respondents, Buddhist, and non-religious respondents. And they all said that they disagree with that statement. That, in other words, if we were to detect a civilization beyond Earth, it would not cause a crisis in my faith. All right, everyone seemed to work out some machinery of accepting this within their faith tradition. The irony and the interesting thing was that he also asked them, "What about these other traditions, not your own? But how do you feel that this other faith tradition would respond if we found life on some of them?" And I don't have the chart for that, but nearly everybody said, oh, these other faiths would fall apart, or these other philosophies, they could not handle this, it would blow them out of the water. And you even see some of this just in the whole idea of, and maybe you've sensed some of this in the way the search for life elsewhere is sometimes discussed in popular literature. It's almost has a kind of religious ethos about it in terms of, if we find life elsewhere, maybe that will kind of be the salvation of humanity because we'll learn something from these other beings, or we will we will be lifted off of our earth-centric views because we will see that we're part of this larger, a construct. And these kinds of things that kind of make almost some of these efforts into a kind of semi-religious aura kind of thing. I will say that other faith traditions have thought about this as well. Here's just a quote from an imam of the 12th century saying that he, the Most High, has the power to create 1,000,000 worlds beyond this world. He was arguing against people who said there were not other worlds. Now, the definition of world is something that we use a little differently now, so I don't have time for that. Christian theology, that's a very interesting question. The Catholic Church had its own Pontifical Academy of Sciences conference on astrobiology a few years ago. That cartoon there was actually in the Washington Post. But basically, they brought in scientists and philosophers and concluded that searching for life elsewhere is very much central and would be a positive aspect of the Catholic faith. If you probe a little bit deeper, though, you have something unique in the Christian traditional Christian view of life, which is that God has become incarnate. God has entered the world in the flesh in Jesus Christ, who was human, Homo sapiens, right? So if that was necessary for human salvation, if you have intelligent civilizations elsewhere, do they also need that kind of incarnate presence of God? And would God be doing that in many different forms and many different planets kind of things, and would they need redemption? Would their sins need forgiving? These are kind of theological issues which in fact are not new. This was actually being thought about in the 15th and 16th century. Here's one French philosopher and theologian who felt that in fact Christ could go around dying for sins over and over again if necessary, but probably wouldn't be fitting. Whereas Bruno, we all know Giordano Bruno, who was infamously burned at the stake, but he felt that God could be glorified not just in a single earth, but in 1,000,000 infinity of worlds. So there was thought about this in Christianity all through history, and I won't go into it, but in more recent years, here's Billy Graham, the Protestant evangelist of our own epoch, and he is quoted as saying that I firmly believe there are intelligent beings like us far away in space who worship God, but we have nothing to fear from these people. Like us, they are God's creation. So you see different reactions or different conundra, but the theological issues are different in Christianity, and I think each faith tradition has its own unique theological issues you have to work through in terms of finding life elsewhere.
And on that very happy note, let me express my profound gratitude to both our speakers who really did a wonderful